year was one of those years. We had a bad year, 30% winter losses. But again, when you compare Nova Scotia beekeepers across the country, the 30% was still less than the national average for winter losses. So we're still pulling around here in Nova Scotia. Also, that figure itself needs to be looked at because it's easy to say that every beekeeper across the province had 30% winter losses, and that was not the case. I think the reason, one of the reasons that we had that higher figure was some of the larger beekeepers had winter losses. And of course, when we've got large influential beekeepers having higher than what they would expect for winter losses, that will affect the average for the industry. There were beekeepers who had what we would call good winters with that 15 to 18% winter losses. But what we're seeing with pretty much everything that we're measuring when it comes to the beekeeping industry, a lot of variability. Okay, so that was the figure. So as we progress through the season, coming out of blueberries, what we were told, and my own bees and talking to lots of beekeepers and industry stakeholders, people were happy with their bees coming out of blueberries this year. The bees look good coming out of blueberries. And we had some optimism that we're going to have a great season. And I think not unlike what we were looking when we were looking at blueberries early in the season, there was optimism. But then something happened, and I think these are where the two industries have this in common. Something happened this summer that what looked like it was lining up to be quite a good season for the honeybees wasn't. And I would say that probably average to less than average in terms of the bee buildup and the honey crop. So those are important considerations for us going into this winter to look at where we're going to be for bees next year. I think the beekeepers overall were satisfied with how the population's built, but I was not talking to anybody who was telling me it was a great year for bees. So it was an okay season for bees from what's being reported to us. Where we're seeing something of concern is with the honey crop. And if you look at the honey crop in Nova Scotia over the last number of years, it's going down. So our average honey crop in Nova Scotia, and we look at other provinces, we saw the same phenomenon. These are early days for this reporting. We don't have the actual data, the stats in front of us for last season yet, but they're coming in, and the preliminary results and in talking to beekeepers indicate that the honey crop is down. So obviously that has impacts on beekeepers, and it has impacts on, that loss of income is significant for the industry and how they can provide pollination services. So that's a trend we're seeing here in Nova Scotia. We're seeing it in New Brunswick, it's being reported, and across the country, actually, we're seeing less of a honey crop. So it's something we're looking at and obviously concerned with in the industry. But going into winter, we had a good fall for getting our bees ready for winter, and we had lots of opportunity to feed because we want warm weather. After we've removed our honey crop, we want nice warm weather for us to feed the bees so that they're supported through the winter. And that looked good this fall. So again, the optimism and resilience in the beekeeping community matches that in the blueberry production industry. So we've got our fingers crossed for next year, and it looks like we're going into winter with that optimism. So just wanted to give that little bit of an overview of how, it's been reported to us, the information we've received, some of it based on preliminary data, talking to beekeepers and industry stakeholders. If you want to know a little bit more about what's going on in the beekeeping industry for this past season, have a look at our blog, because we've done a little report for every province, including Nova Scotia. So just to move on and talk about ATTTA and our work. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Andrew Byers, and I'm the program lead for the Atlantic Tech Transfer Team for apiculture. I'm joined by my Kayla Gaudet, who you'll meet in a minute. Not to repeat what people know or what we've talked about before, but just so everybody knows where we fit into the industry. We are an industry-led project. We're funded by blueberry producers through their association. We're funded by beekeepers through their association. We receive government funding as well. So we're quite, we have our roots are in the industry. So when beekeepers join their associations, when blueberry producers contribute to their associations, we receive guidance and funding to work for you to benefit those industries. And you can see a little bit of here our mandate. We're in a 5-year cycle. I think if people were here yesterday and we're looking at the budgets, you can see that in your budget for your association for 5 years that parallel the SCAP funding program. We're receiving money through that. So we are a project set up. We're run and managed through Perennia, which we're grateful for having that contact. And the team is made up of 2 full-time people, which is Kayla and myself. And then as we get busy through the season, we need more feet on the ground or feet in the fields. We bring on seasonal staff. So last year, we had quite a team working on your behalf. The most people that we've ever had working for the beekeeping and blueberry industry. We had 3 summer staff, and you can see pictured there. If we start from what would be over on your right, John McDonald, and I'll mention a little bit about John's work later, and hopefully you're becoming familiar with John and his work. And he's been on the team for 3 years. Came to us as a undergraduate student and worked with us and did his honors thesis, and now has gone on to do and is undertaking MSc. We've got a couple of other people. Caitlin Newton on the other end came to us for the first time this year. She's a student at Dal as well, and she jumped into the team and integrated perfectly, very quickly with the team, and spent the year with us. And we were grateful to have her. She was a great contribution to our work. Greg Dugas, you can see standing between John and myself. Again, he was back for his 3rd season with us, and he came to us, and I've mentioned this before, but I think I feel it's an important point. He came to us as a co-op student in high school and spent a few weeks with us. So if you're ever given an opportunity to support a co-op student when they're in high school trying to decide on their career, it's a great thing to do. Benefited us, benefited him, and then he stayed on, and as I said, has spent 3 seasons with us up to this point. We will be bringing on seasonal staff again next year. So if in the new year you see an job opening with ATTTA and you want to promote that to anyone you know, we will be looking for people as well. We also had a little bit of help up in New Brunswick. Some of the work we do with our kind of regional remit stretches us a bit thin, and travel time sometimes exceeds the actual time in the field. So we had to bring on some extra hands in New Brunswick to do a little bit of the field work. And we had a couple of people up there led by Gaetan Chasson, who those of you that have been around the industry for a while are well familiar with Gaetan, and we were lucky to have him kind of lead that New Brunswick splinter group that was doing some work just during part of the bloom season when we were really overwhelmed. We weren't overwhelmed, I shouldn't say that, but we did need the extra support, and Gaetan and some others stepped in to give us a hand. So just a little bit of background on who we are and how we fit into things. So the work that we do is split into kind of 2 areas. We are doing extension and knowledge transfer for the industry. Most of that has to do with working with beekeepers, but also when it comes to pollination for blueberry producers, we do a lot of that work. And then the other side of it is our applied, regionally appropriate field work and research, which we'll talk about in a minute. But one of the things that ATTTA has been involved with for a number of years, and I think I have to check with Peter, but we're going into the 10th year of ATTTA next year. From the very beginning, we've done a course with Dalhousie University. In the early days, it was called the Modern Beekeeper, and there's people in this room that did that course. And then through COVID, we had to change the format a little bit because we couldn't meet face to face, if people remember back to those dark days of COVID. So we changed the name to the Fundamentals of Beekeeping. But essentially, the reason for this course and the content we're delivering, although it has changed, is to support beekeepers in the whole region. We have beekeepers come from Newfoundland, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI to do this course. The reason is we support all beekeepers that want to take this training, but the idea is to encourage commercial beekeepers who intend to do pollination. That's what we want to get out of this course. And in Nova Scotia, through the modern beekeeper and the fundamentals of beekeeping, it has had a significant impact on the beekeeping industry. As I say, I look around this room and I know people who are important beekeepers, either through the number of colonies they have or how they participate in the industry through leadership with being on executive of associations, etc. That training has had a significant impact on the industry. We don't get a lot of students. I think at the peak, there was maybe a few more than 30 in this training over the 10 or 12 years it's been in existence. But as I say, those students go on because of the commitment. I think they need to take this course with the time and the economic side of it. That level of a commitment is reflected when they get into the industry, and it gives them a really good foundation to go on. So we've had a successful year this year with the fundamentals of beekeeping. We're already planning for next year's fundamentals of beekeeping. There's information actually on the registration desk if anybody wants to know more, or obviously Kayla and I are here for the day, and we're happy to provide any information and encourage those that you speak with that are intending to get into beekeeping or want to transition from hobbyists to commercial beekeeping to take that training. The other work that we do, one of the things that I mentioned, you know, with updates on the industry, if you want to know what we feel has gone on with our season this year, I've just described it to you, but if you want to read more, it's on our blog. Next week, what you'll find is a summary for people who couldn't attend this meeting with the highlights on our blog. So our blog is read by thousands of people every month. I know I was talking to people this morning and they said, oh yeah, I got your email this morning. And it's become one of those things, David smiling, you didn't read it yet today, but you know it's waiting in your inbox. So people get those announcements every week, and there's always relevant information in there with the beekeeping industry, but also with talking about blueberry pollination. So that's one of the things we put quite a bit of resources in. And I know from feedback from the industry, looking at the stats, that we can measure the impact of those things on social media, that's worth our while to put the resources into that blog. So we'll continue to do that into the future. So what's the buzz with that? Have a look if you're one of the few that don't receive that every week. We do a lot of workshops, training sessions. We've got some online workshops that we do every winter. That started during COVID, actually. We did some online workshops because for those of you that don't know, I officially live in New Brunswick, although I'm not there very much. We're based out of Truro. And when there was restrictions on movement, we couldn't get to Prince Edward Island. So we started to do a little bit more online work to support PEI beekeepers. And then we realized we were naive in the beginning, as we all were, with doing things online. Well, if we can do it for PEI online, we can do it for everybody. And we get up to 70 beekeepers in our winter online sessions, which is, you know, significant when you consider the number of beekeepers in the region. And the winter workshops start next week, actually, and will run through till early in the new year. We were in New Brunswick this year for the Atlantic Bee Tour, which is pictured there in the middle. The Atlantic Bee Tour, if those of you that haven't attended, happens every other year. Last time it happened was in Antigonish here in Nova Scotia, and a lot of talk about beekeeping, but a lot of talk about pollination. As an example, well, you can see in the picture there that Kayla and John are doing a demonstration on managing varroa, which is important for beekeepers, but also important for the pollination industry, because if we don't have healthy bees, we realize the impacts of that for pollination. But also there was a workshop which I must say I kind of pushed for myself, because it's an area that I think we need to do more work on. And we just had a really good demonstration and talk from one of the major commercial beekeepers in New Brunswick on how to organize your bees and palletize your bees to get them ready for pollination. So we had, I don't know, I think it was about 5 different methods of palletizing bees available for people to look at and talk about. So emerging commercial beekeepers who have to go through this process to grow. There are still some people who hand bomb a lot of hives, but we encourage people for their own well-being and efficiencies not to do that, to palletize. So there's an opportunity to explore that. So those sort of workshops are really important to us, and we've got some coming up as well. We'll mention today. Lots of fact sheets and information available. We've talked a little bit about the one we did last year that was published, Protecting Pollinators from Pesticides for Wild Blueberries. We did that with the Pollination Partnership. There's hard copies available on the desk out there, and it's obviously available on our website and the Pollination Partner website. So that's one of the things we did recently. Most of what we do in terms of preparing fact sheets and reports is in response to industry. So we did one last year because we realized in the industry we need to know more about electric fencing. So we've done a fact sheet on that recently. We talk an awful lot about varroa because in the beekeeping world, as everyone's aware, that's such an important thing. And we'll talk about that this morning, and we won't stop talking about that. I wish we could, actually, because that would mean the problem's resolved. But in the meantime, until we have a permanent resolution, we'll have to start talking about it. So fact sheets and guides are always something that we're working on. So in terms of just talking a little bit about the research that we've done this year, we've kind of grouped it into two themes: pollination efficiencies, which I'm going to talk about, and then the important work we're doing around honeybee health. So to begin with that, this is something that I've talked about before. And again, just to go back to the guides that we published, we've recently published a Best Management Practices Guide on pollinating wild blueberries in the Maritimes. And there's quite a bit of information on some of the research we've done previously. And one of the things we did, and we put information on the on that work into the guide, and I've talked about it here, but it was a couple of years ago, was being more efficient and doing sequential loading is what we call it. But the concept is that, and many people are doing this, many producers are doing this, but just as an option to make people, to add another tool to the toolbox, so to speak. We looked at applying bees in kind of a static way or a conventional way. You apply all your bees in one load, and then we looked at putting part of the bees on in the beginning and then following them up a period of time later, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. So hopefully there's some recollection of that work we did previously. And what we want to demonstrate is that by following the bloom, essentially, with your application of pollinators, that you can achieve the same pollination as putting all of your bees on in one static load. So I've put this up here, and it shows the different field locations that we used this year. So what the goal was this year was not to do a large project like we did in 2022, where we had a number of paired fields across the region, but just to repeat the work on one pair of fields, because what that will do, as you're aware, with the blueberry cycle, we can't do the same work every year. We have to wait a couple of years. But we just wanted to revisit one pair of fields just to kind of validate what we'd found previously. So that's what we did this year. And this figure that's down in the bottom corner there, one of the things, just note that the 2022 information is in the Byers with the blue shading, and the 2024 information is in the bars with the green shading, because that's something just to keep in mind. So when we do this, the first thing we go in is we look at the fields and make sure they're more or less in the same condition. So you can't really compare two fields if you know, like Scott was showing us as well. You know, look at the fields before you do the treatment. And in 2022, you can see on these same two fields, the bloom was at the same place when we went in initially. And this year, this is an interesting thing just to realize as well. there wasn't a significant difference. You know, when we look at the statistics, there wasn't a significant difference between the two fields, but you can see there's an observed difference between those two fields. And I just wanted to let you know, just, you know, a nugget of information to take away with you. The actual difference in the means of those fields were about 5%. So when we went in on the same day on two fields that were only a few kilometers away from each other, there was an actual 5% difference in the percent bloom on those two fields. So don't make assumptions based on looking at one field that the field down the road is going to be the same. But statistically, there was no difference of those. So you can see in the columns there's a little bit of background information in all the fields. And if we go down to the bloom percent, you can see the difference there between what we've called NS001 or field 1 and field 2. And then you can also see the stalking rate there. So when we go in initially, as I think is common practice, we talk about stalking rates in terms of hives per acre, which is a good measure. But what we like to do is look a little closer at the hive, and we do a number of measures, but one of the additional measures we do is we look at the number of frames in each of those hives, because we all know that not every hive is the same. So if you want a very precise measure of stocking density, and this is a practice in the industry as well, but not as common as looking at hives per acre, you can measure frames per acre. So again, if you look carefully, you can see that there is a little bit of difference, about 10% difference when you do the more precise measure in what you're getting than when you just do the more gross measure of hives per acre. But you can see in those two fields that, you know, when you take into account the size of the fields and the stocking rate is around 2 hives per acre, just a little over for both of them. But in the second field, you can see that the initial placement on the 27th of May of half the hives was at 1. And then when we went in, we could say a week later, but it's about 6 days later, you can see that that was up to 2 hives per acre. So the ultimate stocking of those two fields was very, very close. And you can see this concept of following the bloom with your application of your pollinators. We went in at 25%, which was better than the 2 years before, but again, probably a little later than we'd recommend. But again, when you're getting towards nearer peak bloom, you can put the second application. So what we want to do again, as we did before, was look at measures of pollination success. Is there a difference? Because what we don't want to see is there's a difference. We want these two fields to look the same. The most important measure of pollination success that we use is fruit set. So when you go into these fields, we've had 2 different treatments of the fields. We've applied the pollinators differently. Is there a difference in fruit set? And you can see there, as we found in 2022 when we did the same thing, this year there was no difference in the 2 fields in the year. You can see a difference between the 2022 year and the 2024 year. That's not what we're looking at, but I thought it might be of interest to put that information and make it available to you today. But this is what we want to see. So what we've done is we've done the same thing. We've reversed the control and treatment as well with these 2 fields as part of our validation, and we ended up with the same confirming results that when you apply your pollinators this way, there is no difference in this measure of pollination success, which is fruit set. We do look at other measures that relate to pollination success, but as you get further away from fruit set, which is fairly immediate, a couple weeks after pollination, that's a good, clear measure of success. And then as you progress through the season, there's so many other factors that come into play that can impact on the percent of mature fruit. So we've counted blossoms, how many of those blossoms result in mature fruit. That's an indicator of pollination success, but a lot of things happen between pollination and this would be just before harvest. We also measure the berry weight, and Dr. Percival this morning talked about and explained why we would do that as a measure of pollination success. Better pollination should result in better berry weight. But again, the timing between placement of pollinators in the spring and the berry weight at harvest, which is what this would be, a lot of other factors come into it, but we do look at it. We also look at seed count, which was also mentioned this morning, and why that is important. But overall, we found no difference in many of these measurable factors, which confirms the results we got previously. I thought it would be just of interest to also talk about the average blossoms per stem comparing the 2 years, because we were told by the grower that their observation was that there was a tremendous bloom on these fields compared to what would be expected. We saw it as well, and that blossoms per stem, you can easily see the same fields put side by side with the blue being 2022 and the green being 2024. You can see clearly the difference in the stems, the blossoms per stem across those two fields. As you can see when we looked at the fruit per stem, ultimately at the end of harvest. So I just thought that would be an interesting thing to present to people, that, you know, this field, and I think that wasn't just these two fields that was seen this year where we saw, you know, what looked like excellent bloom in terms of blossom numbers, and then a difference when it came to harvest at the end of the year. So that, I think now we've done the work in 2022, we've validated it this year. So hopefully that is now a tool that can go in the toolbox, an option for producers to realize that the conventional or historic way of just placing all your pollinators in one static load at the beginning of bloom is not the only option. You can also, as I'm saying, follow the bloom with application of pollinators later. So what we've gone on to do, and I'll just speed this up a little bit because I know we've got a lot to get through, but we've gone on to try and look at things that we can assess in the sprout year that will help growers to make decisions about how many pollinators they need in the following crop year. So we all know that honey beekeepers struggle to respond to requests for additional colonies. You know, a 2-year cycle for that would be optimal for beekeepers. But if there's something that we can look at on the fields that will help us make decisions, then that would strengthen that relationship and communication with beekeepers. So we've gone on to the fields and we've looked at a couple of different measures of things in the sprout year to see if that gives us an idea of what the blossom number will be. And ultimately, we're looking at how many blossoms are on the field, because that helps us understand how many insects we need on the field to service those blossoms. And we initially looked at a couple of things. I think the floral bud count is interesting to look at quickly, because we thought there'd be a strong relationship between the height of the stem and the number of floral buds. And we did see a positive relationship on that, but not maybe as strong a relationship as we really like to see, to suggest this is a beneficial tool for producers to make assessments to determine what the bloom will be for the next year. But all of this work that I'm talking about now will be repeated next year, and we'll have more information to share. And again, a little bit of a stronger relationship modeled with that red line through the data, with the heights of the stems and the number of leaf buds. But for floral buds, it seems like maybe there's some merit in looking at this, but I would really like to see that red line a lot steeper before I could say this relationship demonstrates this would be a really good tool. The other thing that we did, and I'm not going to go through this whole table, don't worry about it, but it's got all the information there, and I know that Peter and Janet will share all these slides after the meeting, so if you want to go through it. The other thing that we wanted to look at was, if you are going on the field, at what point is it quite obvious that you can differentiate leaf buds from floral buds? Because if we're making assessments going, okay, here's the number of floral buds, we're getting some good figures on how many blossoms does that translate into, which we can talk about in another meeting. But where and how is the best way to determine the timing of that? So on the bottom there, what you can see is, if you look down, you've got leaf buds, floral buds, total buds down the column. Then you've got D percentage, which is the percentage of buds that we could differentiate from floral to leaf buds. And also the growing degree days at that point, and then the date. So we're using the growing degree days more and more, because with climate change and uncertainty with their weather, they're becoming much more relevant than the actual dates. But you can see the 72% in the D column and the 92%, and then the corresponding growing degree days. What we're doing is we're looking at that window. When can we go on a field and we can differentiate floral buds? And when I say we, I mean us, but then as an indication of when growers could go on and easily differentiate. So we narrowed it down this year. We started at 1900 growing degree days for the data collection this year, and we've narrowed that window down, and we're trying to really pinpoint that range. When can we differentiate buds on a field? And then see if that's a useful tool for growers to make decisions about the number of blossoms the next year. Okay, Kayla, you better get up here because I've talked too long, which is not unusual for anyone that knows me. This is the last thing for me. We are doing some work with Dr. White. You'll be surprised to hear that he has any more time to do any more work after his presentation earlier, but with John McDonald and Dr. White and our team, we're looking at refining the bloom model for growing degree day model for bloom, so we can more precisely make decisions about timing, firstly, of applying pollinators. So you can see the growing degree days. This is just a typical field in Nova Scotia from our work this year. You can see the growing degree days along the bottom. You can see the open flowers in terms of percent along the other axis. And you can see this lovely curve showing bloom. And this sort of information will be available to growers, and you can make decisions. So for example, you want to, look at, 10% bloom for application, you can map that against this. So this improved growing degree day model of bloom is something that we hope to have in the hands of producers in the next year to 18 months. And you'll hear a lot more about it. You've heard about it already, but it's also some important work that we're doing. So I'm going to pass over to Kayla. Sorry, Kayla, taking more time than I should have, but and Kayla's going to talk a little bit about our Varroa work.
Hello, everyone. As Andrew's introduced me, my name is Kayla Gaudet, and I'm a full-time apiculturist with ATTTA. Shouldn't be more than 5 minutes more of your time. I know we're all anxious to get to lunch, but it's a pleasure to be here today. So thank you for having us here and taking the time to listen to our research. One of our ongoing projects with ATTTA is Varroa mite research. ATTTA has been conducting Varroa mite research since 2017. Each year our project varies slightly, but each has the goal of better understanding how to effectively monitor and manage Varroa mites. This past year, ATTTA conducted a regional Varroa mite survey across the Maritimes. We collected samples at 3 important times throughout the season. So prior to pollination, after pollination, and then there was a late season collection around the time honey supers are being pulled. We had some beekeepers mail us samples of honeybees, and we processed them back in our lab. For other beekeepers, we were able to get out to their apiaries, and we did the collections ourselves. Our survey allowed us to measure Varroa mite trends across the Maritimes throughout the season, and I'll highlight these results on the next slide. We are also able to continue with our miticide efficacy testing by performing a lab-based study, and I'll also discuss this in a couple of slides. And finally, we now have a stored bank of honeybee samples for possible future testing, which is likely to include a tracheal mite test. Okay, so talking about our Varroa mite survey, and it occurred in all 3 maritime provinces and included 23 beekeepers, 25 apiaries, 81 colonies, and 167 samples. The number of samples positive for Varroa mites increased by 61% from early season, where we've seen 7% of colonies that had detected Varroa mites, to late season, where 68% of colonies had detected Varroa mites. The number of colonies above the economic threshold increased by 8% from early season, where 2% of colonies indicated treatment was needed, to late season, where 10% of colonies indicated treatment was needed. It is important to understand that the population of Varroa mites increases throughout the beekeeping season, which is reflected by the increase in mites sampled between May and June, which would be trial 1, and September, which is trial 3. The results of the survey support the fact that the population of mites increases as the beekeeping season progresses. This makes early spring monitoring and treatment for Varroa mites crucial because populations can easily get above the economic threshold if waiting to the fall to treat again. Beekeepers need to be vigilant with monitoring mites each month to ensure that colonies will be strong and healthy by the time winter preparations occur. If a beekeeper is seeing mites during the early part of the beekeeping season, then they should be prepared to provide treatment by fall. So for the past 2 summers, ATTTA has assessed the efficacy of amitraz, which is the active ingredient in Apivar, against pheromites through lab-based studies. So this is our 2nd year of this study. When analyzing the 2023 and 2024 data, we can conclude that the concentration of amitraz has a significant impact on mite mortality, where with increasing concentration, there is increased mortality. In other words, higher concentration of amitraz are more effective at killing the mites, suggesting a dose-response relationship between the amitraz concentration and mite mortality. One notable limitation to our lab-based study over the past 2 years is the relatively small sample size of mites that were included in the study. So this may not be representative of the entire mite population. Additionally, the data was collected from just 8 beekeepers, which further limits the generalizability of the findings. Given these limitations, it would be premature to make a conclusion about any level of reduced efficacy, and we plan to repeat the study in the coming years with more beekeepers involved. Okay, I just want to take a quick minute to highlight other research that ATTTA is currently working on. So this includes, we've completed 2 seasons of captively breeding bumblebees to better understand bumblebee biology and to support our mandate of using non-apis pollinators in Atlantic Canada. In partnership with Bryce Cross from St. Mary's University and John Murray, ATTTA has developed a course to help develop beekeepers' business knowledge with a focus on the economics of wild blueberry pollination. This course was scheduled for late last month, and it was postponed, and a new date will be announced as soon as possible. So we do have that in the works. ATTTA is currently working to develop a best management practice guide for beekeeping in the Maritimes. Our team has undertaken training on queen rearing and has devoted time to practicing rearing queens this past summer. And the intention with this training is to next summer start a queen banking project, which is a follow-up from research that's happened in the past with ATTTA. And finally, ATTTA is working with industry to have an information day around the guide protecting pollinators from pesticides. So that was the one Andrew highlighted on the earlier slides of our presentation, and it was published last winter. So stay tuned for information on that. I know we're probably short on time for questions, but we're happy to discuss any of our research with you guys during the breaks. I want to thank you all for having us here today to listen to our research update. And most importantly, I want to thank all our sponsors. Specifically, a lot of our research is funded through ERIE funding. So we just want to acknowledge that partnership as well. Thanks.
I've got one question from online. I think I know the answer to this, but it's related to, does ATTTA have any focus on native pollinators under the program?
You can go ahead, Andrew. I don't mind.
Yeah. I know there's a great deal of interest in native pollinators and how that fits into this, this bigger, shall we call it a puzzle around pollination. And we're not working on it directly, but we are having discussions across all the stakeholder groups, and where it's deemed important and there's work need to be done. If we can contribute in some way to that, we're doing it, but it's not a primary focus.
Really, the mandate of ATTTA is manage pollinators, specifically honeybees, and exploring into bumblebee right now a little bit.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.